When you're choosing a record, make sure you assess it for quality, no matter who created that catalog record. So just because Library of Congress created it, this does not mean that it's a good record. I have seen some Library of Congress records that are awful. It was probably about the time they cut a huge amount of staff and then cut everybody's pay, and everybody was like, not doing this anymore. And they all went and had coffee in a back room, and who can blame them? So there are some bad records that come from there. Similarly, vendor records are notoriously awful, but every once in a while you get a good one. So don't assume that a vendor record is necessarily horrible. So don't make any assumptions depending on who created the record or where you got it. I mean, it could be coming out of UNCG, and you could call me and say, Sonia, did you create this record? And I say, oh yeah, I created that one. You better double check it. Don't trust any record. It could be something that somebody created with older rules, or that they created on an off day, or before they understood everything completely, or they don't know what they're doing. Who knows? So you need to evaluate those records. And if you find issues with those records, put them in a bucket and send them to the bibliographic cataloger to evaluate and fix. If you find empty bibliographic records, send those along. And we've talked in classes about having a few different buckets set up. Like you could have a high priority bucket, like here's something that needs to be out on the shelves, but I can't figure out a good record for it, so it needs to happen like now. And you could have a low priority bucket. Here are some things that really just need a little updating, or some records that look like they could be merged, but it doesn't have to happen this second. Stick that in there. And that way your bibliographic catalogers aren't sitting there buried in all the stuff that you've just sent them. You're helping them out with those different levels. So that's something you can come up with, again, on a sort of a local level, talking with the different levels of catalogers, saying, here's what you're going to do, here's what you're going to do, and here are the buckets we're going to use, and this way we communicate things. And then finally, you want to follow the procedures for editing and deleting items and volumes. So don't delete open transactions, and let's look at that rule. So editing and deleting volumes, there's a whole section for this. Yay! So it talks about editing your items, changing call numbers, talking about the types of things that you're able to do in circulation, so you can change status, shelving location, etc. Talks about editing volumes, talks about deleting items, and this one's important. So make sure that you're not deleting something that has like a checked out status, lost, long overdue, lost and paid, in transit, or on hold. Leave it there. So make sure you glance through that. We're going to talk about some of it today, but this is, really, this is going to be your cataloging Bible that walks you through a lot of what you need to do. And it talks about the order of deletion, which we'll look at later. So when you're cataloging, there's actually a lot of different processes and steps that go into that. And I wanted to hit on those different processes just a little bit today for you guys, so you can see like the different things that you look at and the different ways you look at them. So one of the main parts of cataloging is the bibliographic description. And for this, we use cataloging rules like those from RDA and AACR2, which we're going to discuss a little more in just a minute. So that provides you with the description of the resource that is being cataloged. So things like the title, the publisher, the number of pages, all of that is part of that bibliographic description. In order to make that information and other information in the record readable and usable by the machine, because remember, computers are not smart. They need help. We have to use some sort of encoding. And for that, in libraries, we use MARC. We're going to talk a little bit about that too. In order to make our catalogs work in a really linkable, useful way, we use authority control, and this makes it so you can actually say, oh, I like this author, click on their name and find all the books by that author. Or my kid will only read books in this series, click on the name of the series, find all the books in the series. And then we have subject analysis, and for that you have several different parts. So you have subject headings. We favor Library of Congress in this consortium. You have genre form terms. Also, we favor Library of Congress, so there is some other stuff that is okay. And then your Dewey classification, or whatever classification you're using, because I know like for fiction you use something different. For special collections, you quite often use something different. So whatever classification you're using, that's part of your subject analysis, because you're grouping things on the same subject, or that are the same in some way together on the shelves. So let's dig into those a little more. So what this is going to mean for you, description-wise, you're going to need to be able to look at a record and make sure that key elements are present and that they are correct and match the resource that you have in hand. With encoding, you'll need to know where to look in a record for the information that you see above. And some of you may not actually be looking at that encoded record, and that's fine. Some of you may prefer to just look at the record in the catalog and decide what's good and what's not, and then add stuff. That's fine. Your handouts today have both of those possibilities there, but we are going to go over both of them just because in some cases this is the best or possibly the only way to find out if all of the information is there by looking at that encoding. With authority, this will provide those linking capabilities in Cardinal, so we're going to look at how you can tell if the authority record is linking, where those are going to be, and whether stuff is linking. If it's not necessarily a bad thing at this point, because Evergreen is sort of catching up with this. But it's catching up pretty quickly. Every time I do one of these workshops, I see a few more places where it shows that stuff is linked. So your authority linkages are getting better. So that's something you want to check, just to see if stuff is linking. At this point, you won't necessarily do anything about it, but say whenever they let you know from the state library that you should start really looking at this, if you find stuff that's not linking, that's something you'd want to kick to a bibliographic cataloger just so they can check that authority heading and make sure that something's not wrong. And then with the subject analysis, this is something that's generally handled by your bibliographic catalogers, but it's good for you to know what where subject headings are, what they should look like, what your classification should look like, so that you have at least a general idea of whether things are good or bad and need to be sent on. And of course, I mean, with assigning like call numbers, there's a certain amount of that you guys do because you assign those at a volume or item level. That's perfectly fine. You still do that. You just don't change stuff in the record itself.